الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين. The discussion this morning, I think, is twofold. Actually, it's sort of a trinity, no pun intended. The idea is maybe we'll talk about a couple of subjects that we didn't address last night that I wanted to address with you all. They're very heavy subjects based on some current research that myself and some colleagues are working on, to include Muslim suicide. Muslim suicide in the community's attitude towards suicide and suicidal ideation. So how do Muslims view people who engage in suicide or attempt suicide among their peers? And are Muslim youth in particular thinking about suicide more? And why might that be? The second topic is about the book that we recently published on white supremacist mass shooters that target Jewish and Muslim communities. And then I would like to move to sort of an open dialogue and discussion, see if you have any questions, whether it's about the discussion itself or anything that you've heard or anything that's on your mind. I will say, with respect to what we were talking about earlier, I would like to not emphasize that particular topic as much as others, but I'm happy to certainly field questions as you wish. And if I don't know the answer to something, rest assured that I am not ashamed to say I don't know. So with respect to suicide, my colleague and I, she was in Texas and she's now in Michigan, University of Michigan, Dearborn. We were intrigued by what was happening. In my community in North Carolina, we noticed that we had an increase in suicide. So when you look at the Muslim community there, they have a cemetery committee like many other Muslim institutions. And we've had several notable suicides by gun, youth killing themselves, shooting themselves, or attempts at self-harm that were increasing among the Muslim youth. It's important to know that we're talking about a second generation. The generation that we talked about last night, which is living at the hyphen of their identity. They don't know if they're Muslims. They're living between parents who are heavy on their culture and emphasizing their culture and the values of their culture, some of which are, of course, religious values, no doubt. And then they're confronted with a different reality outside. And here I want to also mention something about Islamic schools. And this may not be a popular opinion, but this is based in evidence. So remind me of that I do need to have a bit of a discussion about Islamic schools in the context of suicide and Islamophobia. So we sought out some surveys. We passed surveys around the country. That particular survey, at the time when we presented the findings in Chicago, was very scant. We didn't have much data. Fast forward until a few months ago, I gave the same presentation with a little bit more robust data, but we have generally the same findings. Gave that presentation in Utah to a Muslim youth group that was interested in finding out what was happening, because they're seeing in their communities that Muslims are killing themselves as well. There is an identity crisis that's taking hold in the Muslim community, and we need to acknowledge that. This is also happening at the same time where Muslims, especially immigrant Muslims, are coping with the idea of mental health. That is to say that their children are calling for more mental health discussions, while they themselves find themselves more resilient. That what do you mean you're depressed, right? We're not crazy. We're not going to go to the therapist. We don't need therapy. That's for crazy people. You'll pardon the language. And they end up losing their children in the process. Our institution in North Carolina found it became so rampant that they started talking about it on the minbar, right? In a very nuanced and educated way, evidence-based, without the taboos, without the shaming, and without the judgments. And I think that's what we sought out to do here in this particular study. And what we found was, we sent out a survey to MSAs, we sent out through social media, through Islamic centers' websites, we sent out surveys asking people basically, what do you believe about suicide and people who might engage in suicide? That is to see, how do you judge those people? And we asked them about their own inclinations, their own mental health. With respect to the gender differential, more females, about 66, 70% of the respondents were female, the rest were male across the board. When we looked at age groups, we had a significantly high response rate from 20 to 30-year-olds. And I do want to highlight one thing. When we looked at religiosity, when we asked them, how many times do you attend the masjid? Do you pray 5 times a day, or how many times do you pray, right? So there were several options. We found that the youth, 20 to 30 years old, were praying 5 times a day, generally speaking, but were attending the masjid almost nil. Now, let me tell you why that's significant. Remember what I talked about last night with respect to sort of feeling distanced from the masjid as an institution and sort of leaving the masjid. It doesn't necessarily indicate that they're leaving their faith by simply leaving the institution. It's just that they don't find that it appeals to them. It caters to their needs. Why is this important? Well, there's a sociologist by the name of Emil Durkheim. Emil Durkheim did the first prominent study on suicide. And he wanted to understand, is suicide a matter of free will? Is this something that you decide by yourself? Let me ask you all, do you think that suicide is a free will decision? If I'm sitting at home by myself and I decide to take my own life, what do you think? Free will? Whose decision was it to take their own life? Aside from themselves, does anyone get any blame or culpability aside from the person that chose to take their own life? I'm sorry? Okay, so your argument would be that it's a biological or physiological impulse. Okay, if that's the case, then why be punished for doing so in the hereafter? Okay, well, what do we mean by intentionally did it? Oh, I see. Yeah, that's certainly a subset of suicidal ideation, but that's not the vast majority of people who engage in suicide now. Okay, but my question is, when someone does take their life, is that decision made purely by them? Is that their free will to do so? Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Yes.
I think it depends, right? Sometimes it's yes, free will. People think that, yeah, like when I, for example, when you go Umrah, I was asking the police, why you have all this gap between here and the fence? Because people would come and jump, kill themselves, and think that they're gonna go to the heaven because they died in the haram. So these people commit these suicidal actions in the haram out of free will because they need just to get rid of their past and go to the heaven directly. And some people, as you mentioned, they have psychological problems. Some people think they are possessed by demons or jinn,
What I'm hearing is that there's more nuance to the argument than to say that if you kill yourself, you are solely to blame. Is that an accurate statement? I think historically, our shuyukh have presented it to us, certainly in my generation, presented it to us, if you kill yourself, it's a black and white decision, you go to hell, right? I think the nuance of neuroscience and sociology and such are now giving us a different understanding of how people behave. Emil Durkheim wanted to understand how suicide happens. So here I am in my room and I decide to kill myself. His argument is, someone halfway across the world that I don't know can be thinking the same exact thing and succumb to suicide and suicidal ideation for very similar reasons and not have any connection to me. In other words, if we look at suicide rates across different communities, different countries, etc., the very idea that we have a suicide rate that stays rather stable across time is suggesting to us that there's something about this group, say if we look at Japan versus North America versus Zimbabwe, etc., there's something in that culture, in that society, that is compelling people to take their life at a particular rate each year. That is evidence against the idea that people are simply taking their lives out of their own volition, out of their own free will. There's something going on there. So he wanted to investigate this, and he did. He looked at Catholics and Protestants in Europe, Western Europe, several countries, and what he found was one of those groups is able to resist suicidal ideation better than the other. Which one is that? Protestant resists suicidal ideation? Is that what you're saying? What do you think? Do anyone agree with that? Protestants are more inclined to resist it? Catholics is correct. And Catholics resist it because he found that they work in a very rigid structure. The organization of their faith is very structural and network-based. By definition, Protestants protested the Catholic Church. They were more individualistic. And so because there's no network among them, they have to bear the social pressures by themselves and thus are not as immune to suicidal ideation, which is, for example, I lost my job, right? Unemployment rates, drug use, family issues, those kinds of things. These are social pressures that are imposed on each and every one of us, and Muslims are not exceptional. Those who have the social network are more likely to resist suicidal ideation. What did I say about that group 20 to 30? Are they attending the mosque more, or they're praying 5 times a day? But that does not mean that their religiosity or their perceived self of religiosity is making them more immune to suicidal ideation, because they're isolated and doing it. They're not doing it in the context of a social organization where, as you see, the pressure is relieved because we have the network and we can talk about it. Back to our problem yesterday of Muslims as judgmental. When Muslim institutions are not tolerant, as we were talking about yesterday, whether you're a member of the LGBTQ community or you're using drugs or whatever the case may be, when you feel like you don't have a place that you can come to share those burdens without fear of judgment and alienation and exclusion, right? If you come to that place, then you're more likely to receive the help and the guidance that you need to navigate the social pressures. When we are forcing our children, whether it's purposeful or otherwise, out of these institutions, they can seem to us perfectly fine. My kid's, praying 5 times a day. They're quote-unquote religious. And yet they're succumbing to suicidal ideation. How do we know this? Because when they were asked about this, I wish I would sleep for years on end. I wish I would sleep without waking up. I think about death and dying frequently. These kinds of questions, guess who was answering, yes, I agree significantly more than the other? Second generation younger Muslims are more, a recent study published by JAMA, the Journal of American Medicine or something or other, said that Muslims, among other religious groups, are 2 to 3 times more likely to kill themselves than their co-religious counterparts. So we have a crisis in the Muslim community, an identity crisis that we haven't really captured yet empirically. We don't know what's going on. So yesterday the question was, I think one of the brothers was saying, we have so many questions, we need answers. Well, we haven't asked the right questions yet. We as in not us here, we as a Muslim community have not engaged in empirical work to understand what's going on with us first. We are at a crisis of identity, I would suggest to you. So let me give you a few findings here that I certainly found interesting. We found that they're overwhelmingly educated. Education doesn't stop you from engaging in suicide. We found that they lean towards the 100,000 plus category in terms of income, household income. So they're well-to-do. We found that they're rather moderate in their political views. So it's not hyper-liberalism, it's not hyper-conservatism, that's the cause. We looked at sort of the middle of the U.S. We had some responses from Texas, California, and elsewhere, but largely the East Coast. We found that those who have been diagnosed with a mental illness are less likely to be judgmental of people who they know, bless you, alhamdulillah, that they know who have thought about suicide. That is to say, if you've been diagnosed, then you understand and recognize the need for mental health, and that mental health impacts these decisions. Those who were not diagnosed were heavily more judgmental about those people who they perceived would engage in suicide or thinking about suicide. They would say things like, they will be punished in the hereafter, right? That they are crazy. Right? If you've not been diagnosed with mental health, but if you have, you weren't as judgmental. Religiosity or perceived religiosity among the older generation, that is, the more religious you believe yourself to be in the older generation, the more you are to look down on people who believe in mental health issues or experience mental health crises, etc. So judgmentalism here was heavily associated with religiosity. And the measure of religiosity was a few things. So how many times do you attend the mosque among the older generation? How many times do you pray? Do you believe that you're a spiritual person? These kinds of questions. And we looked at those and we compared to see if they're judgmental of people who engage in suicide. So, they're not attending the mosque. They're praying significantly. We found that younger respondents would say, sometimes I wish I could go to sleep for several years. Those with lower educational attainment, those who weren't as educated, would say, there have been times when I wished that I were dead, wishing to sleep for several years, or having the desire, losing the desire to live. Marital status was negatively associated with suicidal ideation, meaning non-married people were significantly inclined to say, wishing that I was dead, going to sleep for years. So marriage insulates you. It's that social relationship that we talked about earlier. Whether it's between community members or family members, it insulates you from suicidal ideation. Mental health issues are strongly associated with suicidal ideation on multiple items that we measured, meaning if you had mental health, you were also more inclined to have had these kinds of issues. Where does the mental health issue come from? Mental health issues are, facing issues at school, facing issues at work, facing issues of assimilation. We asked about, in the previous study, how they dealt with their parents. A lot of them were compelled to engage in cultural practices that they didn't believe in, but they're doing it for the sake of their parents, and that resulted in them having significant mental health issues. They're finding their identity, and they're being compelled to accept something without understanding why they're accepting it. And when we took our results and we applied them to the published studies, we found that it's identical. I'm looking at a study here in 2019 of U.S. suicidal ideation across the U.S., right? Past year prevalence of suicidal thoughts among U.S. adults in 2019. Ages 18 to 25 had the highest rate. We are succumbing to the same thing that the broader American public is succumbing to. But we think that we are somehow insulated from what's happening outside. It's funny that when you talk to Muslims who find that they have a son or daughter who all of a sudden took off her hijab, the son is using drugs, etc., they become significantly less judgmental of those communities because now it's entered their household and they're having to cope with it in a way that they know, I love this person that is my son or daughter, but now I'm having to make a choice almost that's really problematic because I have stated to my child that these things are a problem and we judge those people. I want us to think about some of the inconsistencies here. If we look at, yesterday I mentioned the war on drugs. And I don't mean to be overly didactic like I'm teaching a course here, but I do want us to sort of, just to set the stage for you. When we think about the war on drugs, there's a certain group of people we call the legalists, and they believe that drugs are bad and drug users are bad people. These are people that generally you'll find them on the conservative right, and they will not be open to discussions of decriminalization or legalization of drugs or mental health issues with respect to the drug use. No. They believe that you have to punish and the drug issue is a criminal justice issue. Okay? Think about where we stand historically on the drug issue as our kids navigate these worlds. Think about where we stand. The second school of thought is called the public health generalists. These are people who say an informed citizenry, as opposed to fear-mongering, and the legalist would say, there was commercials in the 1990s, does anyone remember this, where they would say, this is your brain on drugs, and they'd crack an egg, and then the monster would come out, and so on and so forth, right? These are people that say, let's not lie to children, let's inform the citizenry, tell them what are the benefits and the risks. There's obvious benefit to cocaine. You will get high, you will feel really good. But here are the risks, okay? Then, last but not least, there's what they call the cost-benefit specifists. These are people that say, well, let's not focus all our energy on marijuana, because alcohol is much more problematic than marijuana. Let's focus on tobacco, as opposed to focusing on marijuana. Let's focus on cocaine, etc. Let's use our resources in smarter ways for the things that have the greatest impact on our community. Where do you think most Muslims fall in this discussion among the three schools of thought? The legalists. Legalists? Okay. Consider the following scenario. I come to you and I say, son, daughter, drugs are bad, while I light up my cigarette or I drink my champagne. Think about that. That didn't happen by sheer coincidence. That did not happen by sheer coincidence. There's a group that sponsors drugfreeamerica.org, if you've all heard of it. You know who sponsors drugfreeamerica.org? Tobacco and alcohol companies. Pay significant amounts of money to distinguish between the good drugs and the bad drugs. And so there was never it was never seen as hypocrisy for a parent to say to their kid, don't use drugs while they're drinking their beer or smoking their cigarette. Okay? The point I'm trying to make is we need to have a nuanced conversation about these kinds of issues with our children, whether it's navigating the drug issue. Zero tolerance policy is problematic. It's a very problematic assumption when children are navigating this. I catch you doing drugs, I'm kicking you out of the house. What have you just done? We talked about the social networks and the ability to withstand suicidal ideation. When you alienate the children further, what have you just done to them? When the kids are being loud, kick them out of the masjid. You're familiar with some of the situations that transpired in our masjid, right? Kids are being rowdy, they broke a window, kick them out of the masjid. What have we just done? We've alienated them further. We've made them more susceptible to the kinds of issues that everyone is dealing with. We have sent them a message, conveyed the message that you are not welcome and you're on your own. Suicide happens in contagion. There's something called, and feel free to Google it, suicide contagion. Suicide contagion, let's say among famous people, a famous person dies by suicide. What ends up happening is their fans begin to kill themselves in very similar ways. We witnessed this in North Carolina, even among the Muslim community. A friend of mine killed themselves, died by suicide. I died not only by suicide, but in the same method that my friend killed themselves in. In other words, suicide is viral. And you can have contagion. You can have a lot of people doing the same thing if it catches on. With the social media being sort of making all of us connected, it's also very problematic in that sense. So we need to think about these things in more nuanced ways. The public health generalist folks will say, look, if I come to you, let me just give you a scenario. Suppose I come to you and I say, hey boss, I'm really addicted to crack. In today's world, here Oregon you're saying is liberal and drugs, and I say to you, boss, I'm addicted to crack cocaine. What do you think the conversation is going to go? How long am I going to be employed? 0, right? Okay. If I say to you, hey boss, I'm trying to quit cigarettes, where's the conversation going to go? Oh, well, sure, here we have some pamphlets helping you to quit smoking. The Employee Assistance Program, the EAP, has some counseling. They have some resources they can share, etc. When you remove the discussion from a criminal justice issue to a public health issue, the conversations can happen and the assistance can be found there. When you insist on criminalizing the individual and the behavior and such, that conversation can never happen. I have to continuously manage those pressures myself. I have to keep it underground because I can't engage in those discussions. I'm saying this to suggest to you, aside from the drug issue, that the importance of being accepted in these kinds of places for the youth. For you all not to be judgmental, but to be mentors and mentees, and to accept that this door is not open for angels. This door is open for shayateen. Come on in, no matter what you're doing, come on in. See, when we talk about issues of inclusivity, that's what we really mean. That's what I certainly really mean. That no matter what your issues are, you have someone to connect with without fear of being judged, without retaliation, etc. So that we can connect and you can improve your situation. I want to mention something about Islamic schools, as I said. Islamic schools, there was a recent paper published by social workers looking at Islamic schools, and they said that Islamic schools function to the purported idea of Islamic schools is that they function to sort of mitigate the Islamophobia that's going on, right? They protect and shelter people, the children, from the Islamophobia outside. I agree that that's why we put our children in Islamic schools. Parents in another community, they shared with me that, brother, the Islamic school is bursting at the seams. We have so many students. I said, well, is that a measure of anything? I mean, program attendance, if we say to you, thousands of people attended the program, that's not a measure of success. Because Hitler had so many people attend his programs, and so did Trump. Why are children there? Because parents want to put them there because they want to insulate them from the outside world, because they don't want to engage in the nuanced and very difficult discussions of how to cope with the outside world. It's safer to put your kids in a school that shelters them. But what the social workers found is that the schools actually weren't sheltering them. They were creating a bipolar personality, a schizophrenia in their personality. Here's how. When you put your kid in Islam, and I'm not advocating for no Muslim schools here, just to be sure, so don't chase me out. My plane is tomorrow morning, so give me at least until tomorrow. What I'm suggesting to you is this, that the social workers asked the children to draw themselves, self-portraits. The girls drew themselves, but often drew themselves in an American context. So the hijab was an American flag, or there was something American in the picture. And when they asked the girls, they said, well, we feel comfortable, we can wear this here. We wouldn't do this if we were in public school. But we're doing it because essentially what they gathered from the children is that by virtue of being among peers that are like them, they're able to do this. But they see themselves as distinct from outside world. That in and of itself is problematic. They see themselves as living two lives, that they don't actually belong. When parents and imams and others speak of these Americans, you don't want to be like these Americans, right? That's a schizophrenia. When we ourselves are having discussions about should we go back home or should we not? Well, guess what? While you're having that discussion with yourself, you're losing back home and you're losing here. Because you don't see yourself as taking ownership of these issues here. And when you say, oh, these homeless in Oregon, we're denigrating the homeless, these are our people, potentially our people. When the Prophet ﷺ was asked, should the angels turn the mountains on the kuffar, what did he say? He wishes that someday they will say what? Shahada. He didn't see them as distinct and separate, though it wasn't actually his people. So at what point do we say to ourselves, let's burn the ships that we came on, that's it, we're done, this is our people, let's solve, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala privileged us to be in the wealthiest, most powerful nation in the world. Why don't we see that as a job that's important enough for us to take on? Right? So when we're speaking to our kids about the schizophrenia, back to the study, they ask the boys the same thing. The boys, Islamophobia targets boys as a security threat. Who remembers Ahmed the clock boy? Minnesota, I think. He made a clock and right in the Obama had the securitization of Islamophobia is the security arm, the surveillance arm. It often targets boys. Girls are seen as oppressed and in need of saving. This is the liberal Islamophobia, right? And the sort of conservative Islamophobia is the arm that sees boys and men, young men in particular, as a potential threat. They saw some of that in the literature, but what they also recognized was that the kids at the Islamic school, they had television, they had social media. They were not insulated by virtue of being in an Islamic school. They were not insulated from what Islamophobia was. They had non-Muslim friends who would tell them what's going on, who engaged with them in those discourses. They heard the bad nicknames. They heard being called Osama and such, right? What they did is they caused the schizophrenia. And I'm going to give you an example. As the child grows, the child is told, don't interact with girls. If you're a boy, don't interact with girls. It's an absolute seclusion from girls. All of a sudden, they go outside of the Islamic school, they're back into the public school system or in college, and all of a sudden they have to do group work with Jessica, Samantha, and Roberta and others. And they don't know how to navigate those waters. But in the masjid, they were so accustomed to, because dad or mom were with us, when I see a girl, my eyes are on the ground, I don't talk to them, it's a facade. It really is a facade of schizophrenia. You don't believe me? Let me give you a story. I was on the third floor of a particular mosque, Islamic center, and I was in the elevator. And a woman came by with a stroller. A sister came by with a stroller, and she was going to take the elevator down. She saw me in the elevator, she panicked. So it's as if she went toward the stairs, as if you're going to take a child in a down 3 flights of stairs. I said, sister, it's okay. I left. She took the child down the elevator. I waited for her downstairs. I said, sister, let me ask you a question. If we were in downtown, whatever city we were in, what would you have done? Would you have gotten on the elevator? She said, yeah, but brother, this is a mosque. I said, so the sheetrock is holier? What's the difference? Moreover, this idea of a schism between the genders as opposed to teaching people how to interact with the opposite gender is problematic. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala compelled women or asked women that they be modest in their attire just like He did men so that they can mix into society, not that they can be tucked away and hidden somewhere. So how do we engage with the opposite gender rather than creating a schism between them? Because guess what? A brother said to me, brother, astaghfirullah, in the gym I saw, the gym that is the mosque gym, I saw the boys and the girls mixing in the gym, the young kid. I said, astaghfirullah, brother, imagine what could happen. They could potentially marry each other someday. When Ahmed decides to marry Susie when they grow up, and you say, why, there's so many nice Muslim girls, why don't you? Well, look back at how you treated the idea of genders, how you taught them to interact or did not teach them to interact with one another. You are sowing the seeds of your own destruction later on. There is now a crisis among Muslims in terms of marriage. I have a friend who's an economist, she's a Muslim, hijabi woman, who said, I view this issue of marriage as an economics issue. When we say Muslim women cannot marry but Muslim men are running after Samantha, it's a matter of numbers. At some point, they have to get married. They're hardwired to get married. When a Muslim woman says, a Muslim girl, you find her hijab slipping, you find that the clothes are getting tighter, well, what ends up happening is the judgmental piece, especially among the sisters. You're becoming, this, that, the other. They start judging the sisters. And the boys start judging the sisters. Meanwhile, the boys are preoccupied with Samantha and so forth, right? That's okay. But they're judging the sisters. Well, consider that she is doing what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created her to do. That is to say that she needs to attract a mate. And if she sees that the boys are attracted to this kind of appearance, and they're not even talking to her, and this came out in the survey that I talked to you about last night with the assimilation, where we were talking to the girls on college campuses, and I'll get your question soon, inshallah. The girls were saying that the Muslim boys at the MSA at the university, they treat us like nuns. But we see them with the non-Muslim girls. What do you expect is going to happen? So rather than understanding what's happening, what we're doing is we're shaming the girls. Again, contributing to suicidal ideation because you're not good enough, you're terrible, look at you, you're becoming without saying the word, an unchaste woman. Well, why is she doing this? What is happening among our children that this is happening? I gave a lecture at a major university, and much like here, the groups were segregated, and it wasn't enough for them to segregate in the hall. There was also a wall between them. This is in the United States. And then there was pizza being served. So they decided that they're going to have the males first and the females. I said, let me ask you a question, guys. How many of you here have a class after this? Are you segregating in your chemistry class? I mean, you're wearing hijab. Are you segregating in your chemistry class? That's number one. Number two, when you go to the supermarket, do you ask for a male cashier if you're a male and a female cashier? And if you go to the buffet, do you go by gender? I mean, what are we doing here? It's a feigned, it's fake. It's a facade because it was an Islamic event. Just like the lady said, this is a mosque. That's why I decided I was going to go down the stairs. Had nothing to do, it was a matter of perception management. So that I see her as pious and I understand what she's doing. She wouldn't do the same thing in a non-Muslim space if we're going down the elevator, in downtown. So is this really about religiosity, fearing Allah, taqwa, etc.? Again, don't take my criticism to suggest, no, everybody just hang out by themselves, a khulwa and so on. I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting how do we manage these social interactions in a way that is conducive to a healthy society that does not have the schizophrenia and the added social and psychological pressures that our children are facing. They're already facing a social and psychological crisis. Are we perpetuating it with these cultural acts that don't find themselves historically accurate in the time of the Prophet ﷺ? They don't. I mean, the fact that the woman got up and corrected Umar ibn Khattab suggests to me that she was there among men and women. And this schism, this schizophrenia didn't exist. The fact that Umar ibn Khattab had a woman appointed in the market to go check who's cheating and who's not, meaning she was employed. Then we have other nations telling us, When the winds blow in a particular way, they say Muslim women can't drive. I'm not going to mention the country, you guess it. And all of a sudden, the winds have changed direction, and now they can drive and do whatever they want. So is this really based in religion? It was certainly masquerading as religion. Or is this culture? Patriarchy. So when we talk about mental health, we are culpable. We are partially responsible for our children taking their lives. I'm sorry to say that's uncomfortable. But as I suggested to you yesterday, that's the whole point. We need to self-reflect. There's nothing that happens in the social world that does not have what we call an antecedent condition. A condition that happens before. So sociologists, criminologists, social scientists, when they study something, they say, okay, let's control for age, gender, sex, etc. To see whether or not the control group and the experimental group, whether or not what we have here is a result of some change that we have applied to the groups. Meaning these antecedent conditions predict the outcome. What we have with respect to the Muslim situation when we lament all the time, the Muslims, the Muslims, the Muslims. Let me ask you something. How many of us have attended mosques since we were young kids and we were asked to make dua for Palestine? By show of hands. How's that going? Who said that? Yeah, it's not working. When you say, may Allah help the poor, it's not working. You know, Umar Sulaiman gave, it's a misunderstanding of dua, the power of dua. Brother, are you saying dua is not good? No, I never said that. I never said that. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted us to make dua, and He also wanted Maryam to shake the trunk of a palm tree so that dates can fall on her. Meaning, she was never going to move the palm tree. She was never going to move. If you're familiar with a palm tree with dates on it, she's not going to move the palm tree. What He wanted her to do is take action. If you want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help the poor, then guess what? You become the vessel for helping the poor. Make dua, Allah, help the poor through me. Go do something about it. But you can make dua from here until tomorrow, and I guarantee you Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will do nothing to help their condition. Guaranteed. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if He was going to intervene in everything, where's the test? What are you here for? So the social conditions that you're seeing, you're partly responsible for. It's uncomfortable. But unless we place responsibility and culpability on your shoulders, a masjid is useless. It's a building for us to build our, to maintain character, to maintain identity, but it's useless if it doesn't recognize this is supposed to be a launching pad. This is where we, you know, Angry Birds, you know the game Angry? This is where you send kids out into the world as leaders. Send them out to do the right thing. Otherwise, what are you doing? Protecting your identity? From what? How is that going to help us? Where's the obligation Allah put on us? You are vicegerents. You are khulafat fil ard. What does that mean? Protecting your identity does nothing for us. Does that make sense? So that's the mental health discussion and the Islamic school discussion. Looking at programs to say that, you know, that we're bursting at the seams is to me not an indication of anything other than people are scared and people are putting their kids in positions where they think that they're insulated from these issues. Rather, I would suggest to you it's up to these institutions to teach the children and to teach ourselves how to deal with the issues. That's a very uncomfortable discussion to have. When your kid comes to you and says, like the guy came to the Prophet ﷺ, he said to him, I committed zina. Just imagine the gravity of that kind of a statement. Just imagine the kind of trust he had of the Prophet ﷺ, that he would not exclude him. He would not label him. By Allah, I ask you this. You don't have an imam here yet, yeah? Okay. That's good, because I don't want to insult imams. So, how many of you would trust an imam with the deepest, darkest sin that you've committed? Barakallah feek. Absolutely, absolutely. Depends on who he is. But generally speaking, in your experiences with imams, why are you shaking your heads? You would never trust them with your deepest and darkest secrets? Trusting Allah is great, but we need human contact, we need human interaction, we need guidance, we need advice, we need etc. And if you can't trust the person who is charged with this role, what does that say about us? What are we doing here? Really, what are we doing here? What's the role of these places? When I said to the gentleman yesterday, as I was telling you the story about him, God forbid that these masjids open up to help the homeless. He was rather offended by this. So they would steal. I said, did I tell you to leave them here by themselves? You can have people here on site, just like the university did. They had a campus for them. They call it Safe something Colorado. They provide shelters, they provide medical care, etc. The Republicans were up in arms when New York City decided to have methadone clinics. A methadone clinic is where you slowly and gradually take someone off of the addiction to the drug that they have. They said, we will give you needles. This happened in Singapore too. And the Muslims were up in arms. The Muslims that want to do good in the world were up in arms. How can you have at a masjid a methadone clinic? You don't let these people take drugs in the masjid? Absolutely. Absolutely. There will be social workers, there will be doctors, there will be clean needles, there will be people there to provide social and welfare discussions, mental health, etc. This is a hospital. The Republicans, one of whom was a former colleague of mine, he said, that's the work of the devil. The work of the devil is to provide them with help. I said, okay, let's suppose we don't do this. What's the alternative? Well, if they do it, then that's their choice. That's a problem. To blame individuals for their choices without recognizing that there are social pressures that compel people to make those choices. I'm sorry. Take a break. Yes, ma'am. I'm fine, take a break right now, but just remind me of where I am, because I'm an old man and I'll forget. Jazakumullah khair. We'll take a break because the sister's yelling at me. We'll come back, what, 11:30? 11:30, inshallah? Khair, inshallah. We'll take a break.
Assalamu alaikum everyone, we're getting started inshallah, so if you can come back to the masjid. Jazakallah khair.
There is an open discussion at the end of Q&A? Okay, because I have some discussion momentum.
Assalamu alaikum. So for everybody that's outside, Dr. Amin is going to get started again. So we will go until about 12:20 for one more session, take another 10-minute break, and then we'll do Q&A right before Salat al-Dhuhr, which is at 1:15, inshallah.
Okay, assalamu alaikum. So the last topic that I suggested I'd share with you is I sort of have to talk about Bentham and classical theory here a little bit, but then I want to talk about the book that we just published, which is the White Supremacist Mass Shooters That Target Muslims and Jews. The thing I was saying is about personal responsibility, that oftentimes Muslims fall into this trap, and I think paradoxically it's the same trap that many conservative Christians, fundamentalist Christians, fall into as well, which is blaming solely the individual. I mean, if I had a whiteboard here and I can sit and teach a class, but I would suggest to you that in criminology, as in sociology and much of the social sciences, we talk about something called classical theory. When we look at how people wanted to answer the question, why do people commit crime historically? Why do people engage in deviant acts, suicide being one of them? The answer was often, well, they were dealing with the devil, or they were possessed by demons. I heard that here today, that potentially that it's the jinn and so on. That kind of thinking doesn't suffice. It does not hold up to empirical research. there was a time before, right at the Enlightenment of Europe, when Europe was in the Dark Ages, that some thinkers came about and started thinking about this issue of personal culpability, personal responsibility. And this is Jeremy Bentham and Cesar Beccaria and others, Italian and British thinkers, who said, every human being is endowed with two things: free will and rational choice. And they said that when people behave, they behave rationally. They're rational actors. So if they engaged in crime, it's because they weighed the benefits and the cost. What they call the hedonistic calculus. The hedonism is the idea that you want to enjoy pleasure and you want to avoid pain. And so they make a calculation in their mind and they say, if I steal this money from the bank, how much is it going? How much pleasure will I derive from that? And what's the potential pain that can come from such a decision? And they act accordingly. That's how they weigh their thinking. The problem with that is it fails to recognize that that's not actually how most people function, that people function within a social world that gives them choices. If you simply say, you are a rational being with free will and with rationality, and anything that you decide to do is your own fault, you place all of the onus and the responsibility on the individual, right? And you don't look at the social structures that give rise to how and why people behave. Let me give you an example. C. Wright Mills, the famous sociologist, said, when we look at homeless people, it is a reasonable, and by the way, this is called the Enlightenment era, the age of reason, precisely because of this. If people, in fact, only reason and rationalize their behavior, it is a reasonable explanation to say that you are homeless because you are lazy. Is that or is that not a reasonable thing to say? Sure, it's reasonable. But now you're confronted with new evidence that suggests there are 18 million people that are homeless. That was an old data set. I would suggest to you many more people that are homeless. Does that hold weight when we consider the reasonable explanation of saying that the individual is lazy? It's a character deficiency in the individual. That's why they're homeless. When we apply that to an aggregated data set, like 18, 20 million people, now there's something else that's going on here. This is not mere character deficiency, this is a structural problem. And we have to study what are the structures that give rise to homelessness. Just like we said, with saying that the individual is culpable for their own suicide is one thing, is to blame the individual. And that works if we want to simply sleep at night easy, knowing that, well, it's the individual's problem. But when we turn the finger back on us and say we are culpable in the reason why there's so much homelessness, because of the structures that we built, and the reason why people are killing themselves is because of how we've treated them and the structures and the organizations that we've built, then that becomes problematic, and it's not comfortable for us to raise those questions because it's more comfortable to say it's your problem. Deal with it. Do you agree or disagree with that logic? So if the argument is we are culpable, Bentham and Beccaria, their idea of classical theory in suggesting that only the individual's actions and behaviors are to blame, that doesn't hold weight anymore in the context of empirical research that suggests no. Remember yesterday I said the phone or the computer is created by all of these people. And I asked you, who creates the social world? We don't think of it as something that's created. We think of it as it's a given, that this is how the society is. No, it's intentional. It's systems and processes, and we can have explanations. If we want to see why person X killed themselves, we simply go back in time. Let me give you a recent example. 2 weeks from last Thursday, on our campus, a man came and slit the neck of an 80-year-old woman. She was waiting on the bus stop. He slit her throat and killed her. 5:30 a.m. that morning, he stabbed someone to death. The police officer that arrested him was in my class later that evening. And when I inquired, he said, yeah, we caught the guy on campus here. I said, well, and I saw the old lady. I had just parked my car. I saw her dead on the fence in a pool of blood. So I told my criminology students, I said, let's stop for just a second. I know you have an impulse to be upset with this guy and you can't wait, etc. He said, now this guy, when we caught him, when we arrested him, his toes were shaking because he was so high on meth. Okay? A severe problem that's ongoing in Colorado and elsewhere in the US. So I said, it's our inclination to want revenge. But you're criminologists, the students, you're criminology students. I want you to separate yourself from this event. The most heinous of events, serial killers and others, separate yourself. Let's ask ourselves a question. How is it that this 26-year-old man, who was once in kindergarten, his children, may Allah protect them, who was once in kindergarten, how did he come to do this? What happened? Can we reverse engineer? Now this is where engineering comes in. Barakallah feek, this is good now, the engineering is good. Social engineers can work backward and tell you when this happened. And I said to my students, what do you think? Well, they said maybe, just maybe, he was raised with a single mother who didn't pay enough attention to him. And thus he found himself what we call engaging in deviant acts with deviant peers. We call it differential association theory. So he finds himself with other deviant groups, and that leads the trajectory of his life down a particular path because of the influence of peers. Like the Prophet ﷺ said, a good friend is the one whom is like going into the perfume shop and you catch a good smell from them, and a bad friend is like the metal worker, the blacksmith, who, when you leave them, if nothing else, you've burned your clothes a little bit. The Prophet ﷺ is telling us about differential association theory, basically. That could certainly be one explanation. Another explanation could be, hey, he was a victim of the opioid crisis, of the corporations who in their internal memos said, we want our salespeople to sell this drug to doctors like Skittles to children. Now we're finally holding them accountable, and we're holding them accountable precisely because whites have succumbed to a lot of the opioid issues. So they conducted an investigation and found out that the company was pushing opioids to the point where this is what we have now. He perhaps had a back problem, back surgery, something. Went to the doctor, was hooked on opioids. From opioids, it went to this situation. A whole host of scenarios can explain why a kindergarten child later becomes a killer in this fashion. By the way, he probably will not remember what he did. He will not remember that he killed 2 people because he was so strung out on meth. I view him as a victim of social circumstances that led to this. Can we say he's completely culpable? I would suggest to you, no, we can't. He is certainly culpable for taking the meth before he did this, but in the trajectory of his life, he's not culpable. And forgive me, are there young children here? There are no young children. We study serial killers. There was a guy who went to work in the morning in North Carolina. No, sorry, his wife went to work in the morning. She worked at the airport, RDU airport. When she went to work, he took his daughter, killed her, chopped her into 1,000,000 pieces, put her in a barrel, tied the family dog to the barrel, and he was filled with blood. And as he was driving, he was stopped by a police officer. The police officer inquired. The guy said, I just saved humanity from the devil. He was schizophrenic. Schizophrenia is known. There's this issue of gouging people's eyes if you're schizophrenic, oftentimes family members, because you believe that the devil is coming out of their eyes. When the forensic psychologist testified and when he spoke to my students, he said, you know, the wife at the time was Googling what are potentially some of the signs of mental illness because she thought something was going on with her husband. When everyone testified in the neighborhood, the family and others, they said he absolutely loved his daughter. He was an ideal father. An ideal father. He actually thought he was helping humanity. Is he culpable for this? If you understand what mental illness is, no, he's not. So to suggest that this is merely your decision, so when the kid comes to you, a Muslim child comes to you the parent or you the organization, and says, I've done X and Y and Z, the assumption that what we said is true, that you do have a trust with the imam or with the people here. Are they judgmental? Is this a safe space for me to come and engage in these discussions? Or are they going to shun me from the community? When they do you say this is your fault? Or do you understand that there are social forces that have potentially compelled them into this kind of behavior? Whatever we're not making excuses. We're suggesting that, if there was a spectrum, if I was to draw an arrow here, social scientists look at it in two ways. They say either you're determined, what's called hard determinism, that everything that happens to you, this is always a computer. Never going to be anything but a computer. You are always going to be a criminal because of these conditions, biological, psychological, social, etc. Or, on the other end, the free will. Well, no, it's not determinism, it's free will. Then it's only the individual's fault, not psychology, sociology, and other issues. There's a third, and one that I think is most acceptable by most people, certainly people of faith, which is that it's called soft determinism. That yes, you are determined in a way. Your conditions are determined by where you find yourself. You're not Buddhist for a reason. You're not Catholic for a reason. You were born into a Muslim family. You encountered Muslim friends and thus reverted. All of these things are sort of predictable if we walk ourselves back. But you make choices within the opportunities that you have. To suggest everything that you do is an absolute part of free will is problematic. Let me give you a little bit of an experiment. And then I'll go into my other one. If I say to you, I have keys here for a Ford Focus and a Lamborghini Diablo. Let's look at the young guys and gals. What are you taking, the Ford Focus or the Lamborghini Diablo? Yes. Lamborghini? Why? Oh, so your decision was influenced by everybody. Was not a free will. Do you have children? That's the stupidest decision you can make. It only seats two people. I see. It's not a rational decision, like Bentham told us. It's a decision influenced by what society wants. Where's the free will in that? If I say to you, would you like to drink? What's your favorite drink? Water. MashaAllah, health nut. I will have, here's a cup of octopus juice. Freshly squeezed. Would you drink it? Why not? Why don't you like it? Well, why don't you like it? You don't know it. That's part of the answer. You don't like it because you don't know it. What if you grew up in a society in which octopus juice was consumed since you were a baby? So your taste buds predict whether or not you're going to make certain choices. Your socialization predicted whether or not you're going to make certain choices. Where's the free will? Okay, try it, you don't like it because you're not, it's an acquired taste. Acquired how? Acquired by your socialization. So the point is that I would suggest to you that we live inside the spectrum of free will and hard determinism. We are in the center where we make decisions based on the things that are provided to us. So I just wanted to conclude that with making you understand, hopefully, that when these children come to you with these issues, and they will, increasingly they will, whether it's drugs, boyfriend, girlfriend, etc., the inclination to judge gets very small when it happens in your household. You see Sophia, you see what happened to her family. Her kid came out as gay. But then guess what your kid did? Or you see Sophia, her kids smoke. Our kids, mashallah, now our kids are 5 and 6, but when they're older, that's a problem. Now all of a sudden, we found out they smoked. Now we're not judgmental of Sophia anymore, because we have to contend with this issue. It's happening in our households. We are subservient to the social issues just like everybody else. So rather than judgmentalism, let's start to deal with it in systemic ways. That's it for that. The second discussion is something about our book, Shameless Self-Promotion. This idea of white supremacist mass shooters. So we wanted to investigate, my Jewish colleague and I, we said, look, it seems there's a template going on. This happened right during the Trump era and continues. You heard of what's her name that said Jewish lasers are the ones responsible for the fires in California, that there's lasers that Jews control the world and so on. There's something called ZOG, Zionist Occupied Government. This is a long-standing theory that suggests that the Jews control the government. And now, we've also been selected, mashallah, that the Muslims are also controlling government and they're controlling the world. Nobody told us this. But this is so there's what's called a doppelganger, a mirror image of theories. And what we find is when we had to read all of the manifestos of the mass shooters, we read all of them, we found that they were using the same thing, that Jews and Muslims are controlling the world, they want to undermine Western civilization, and that's why we need to go and kill them, eradicate them. It's the Jews are letting in the Mexicans, the Muslims look at Ilhan Omar and others, right? So the conspiracy theories are two. The first one, many Muslims believe in this and have perpetuated it themselves, which is, who can guess the conspiracy theory against Jews? It's very prominent in the Middle East. It came in from Russia, made its way to the Middle East. Who can tell me the name of it? The name of the theory that Jews are controlling the world. What was it? Someone said it. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Translated in many languages. Came across the... I'm sorry? The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's a forgery from the Russian Tsar in 1903 or something. No. That's the point I'm making. That it's not in fact authentic. That they were somehow, the Jewish elders were sitting in it's almost as if it's a horror movie. They were sitting in a cemetery and there's smoke and they're sitting there saying, how are we going to control the world, right? That's the idea. And it goes through Russia to the Middle East, it becomes very popular, a lot of anti-Semitism, or rather I would call it, my friend and I don't call it anti-Semitism because Arabs are Semites, we call it anti-Jewishness, right? So that's the theory with respect to the Jews, that they are controlling the world. Muslims have something else. There's a book called Eurabia. Eurabia, the Euro-Arab Axis. You can Google it. It's used by a lot of white supremacists. Incidentally, she's Jewish, which is a bit ironic. The author of the book, her pseudonym is Bat Yor, but she's actually not. She's Jewish from Egypt. See, I knew it was the Egyptians. So she's Jewish from Egypt, and what's funny about that is that the white supremacists that kill Jews also use her book, right? They don't recognize that she's Jewish. So these two theories state that Jews are undermining the world, and somehow the Muslim Brotherhood is the prominent it's called the project, right? That they are undermining the Western civilization. The Muslim Brotherhood, which of course has been stamped out by many of the Arab leaders, they're saying that the Arab leaders are working with European leaders to put the Muslim Brotherhood in positions of power and undermine. Anyway, I'm confused too. So the theory is that we're undermining Western civilization. So these white supremacists, the mass shooters, they get onto the internet. And our argument is they get hooked onto the internet just like we suggest that the child got hooked to opioids. They get into these gamer sites, 4chan, 8chan, Gab, and elsewhere. Typically, remember I said that the guy who killed the lady on campus 2 weeks ago, I said that he may have come across bad friends and was influenced by those friends. But John Ernest, one of the guys that we pay attention to, he's the guy that burned a masjid and shot up the synagogue in San Diego. California. We have no explanation for him. He was a white kid from a fairly liberal background. He had affluent parents. He played renditions of Chopin on the piano. He was a nursing student and wanted to help people. And all of a sudden he goes and shoots up a synagogue and burns down a masjid. Now why would he do that, the question is. And as we looked into their work online, we found that they were engaging with others that believed in these conspiracy theories that were being perpetuated. They're being perpetuated in ways that are interesting. You see, and if this was 1980, you would have to go read the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. You'd have to actually sit and read a book. Most kids aren't reading books anymore. So how are these ideas being perpetuated? We call it the breakdown of grand theories, these grand ideas. They're being perpetuated by memes. Memes are passed along. When the COVID situation happened, you saw a person in masks slowly transitioning to a woman in niqab. That the Muslims, you see, this is a Muslim plot, the COVID situation, they want us all, they want to oppress our women. And memes actually cause neurological changes in your brain. There have been studies to suggest that memes are mind viruses. Meaning, you see a meme, and the idea of a virus, it's interesting that this happened during COVID. What's the role of a virus? To do what? To replicate, to spread. Sometimes it kills the host, but it's not the intention of the virus to kill the host, because if it kills the host, it dies, it doesn't spread. Memes function in the same way. You get a meme, even amongst yourselves. I guarantee if I open the WhatsApp groups here, there's all kinds of memes. And even if you're repulsed by the meme, what do? Oh my God, this is horrible. Send it to 30 people. Right? That meme has just reinforced your ideology and your beliefs without actually inquiring about it. Bernie Sanders is a damn socialist and he wants to whatever. And that's what you already believe? You pass it along. It has infected you, and you are even going, it so infects you that they've done research on how people participate in rallies, like Trump rallies, and it started back from just getting memes. Being addicted to memes and ideas that they never actually verified, but it's passed off as truth in a post-truth world. What was truthful back in the day, you had to have evidence for it. Social science and scientists say that the best thing that you can do with a theory is to prove it false, to falsify a theory. That's how you know what the truth is. This is false, then this must be the truth. Right? This goes up because of jinn holding it up and comes down. No, it's not. It's because of gravity. If we falsify the jinn argument, we determine that there's something else. Gravity. Make sense? That's how you come to understanding. In the world of the internet, the truth is what's viral. And we quote Trump for saying, a lot of people told me. A lot of people are saying. He never really gives us evidence, he said a lot of people. And that's supposed to convince us because a lot of people are saying. And that's what happens. A lot of these memes are being passed around. The more they're passed around, the more truthful they become. When they infect people, they go out and they put bumper stickers. Imagine that you believe in something so much that you go to a store, leave your children, honey, you can cook something? No, I have to go to the store and get this bumper sticker about Trump and MAGA and, lock her up or whatever the case may be and put that on. What's the intention of me putting on a sticker like that? To infect you with the same idea. So they became infected. They may have come across these websites by absolute coincidence. Gamers. When they got on these websites, they were infected. They said, we get those damn Arabs, that's right, they want to take over the world, etc. Well, guess what? Here's our argument that's very problematic for all of you, I'm sure. The people that killed Muslims and Jews probably did not hate Muslims and Jews. Probably did not hate, though they say in their manifestos that they did. Our argument is that they probably didn't, because I understand if a guy from San Diego, someone in his youth stole his girlfriend and he happened to be Muslim and or Jewish. That's one thing. Or maybe you flicked me off when we were in traffic. I understand that you have some animosity. But when we look into their background, they never interacted with Muslims or Jews. It's the lack of interaction that generated the hate, because they can't verify it against something else. Interacting like we talked about yesterday, whether it's personal contact or vicarious contact or representation in the media, they have nothing to work against. So what ends up happening, if I want to join the Bloods, a gang called the Bloods, this is the leader of the Bloods right here, right? Who's the enemy of the Bloods? Anyone know? Huh? Crips. So I go here to him and I say, look, is it true, good sir, that the Crips are bad? You're saying they're bad. Can you please verify that? Is that how I join the gang? Or what do I have to do? To profess that I hate the Crips, like he says. Everything they say about the Crips, I have to profess that. I have to say, yeah, absolutely, those Crips are bad, etc., because I want to join the group. Right? I want to be an American so badly. Yeah, these are the enemies of America. I join the group. You profess the credo of the group so that you join, not necessarily because you believe what they're saying, but you want to join the group. You want to blend in. You want to become invisible. Human nature, people say, I love to talk to individuals, but the minute there's 2 of them and 3 of them and 4 of them and 5 of them, it becomes a problem, because then they create a culture. And all of a sudden they're wearing stripes and they're having certain things that they do, right? These people create cultures, create ideas about others, create group think. Now these people join, they blended in with the others, but then when they blended in, there's a problem of ego. Because I'm special. Every one of us wants to be special. I don't want to just blend in and disappear. I also want to stand out. So guess what they were writing in their manifestos? Who's going to be man enough to go and rid us of these Muslims and Jews? And by golly, it's going to be me. I'm going to do it. Who's going to get the highest kill count? They were talking about it as if it's a game. Who's going to get the highest kill count? And so they did. They went out and they massacred and live streamed. Because that's how you know it's about ego. When you want to commit a crime, typically what do? You hide it. But why would you put it on live air? Why would you write a manifesto? Since 2015, the FBI is saying that they're seeing what's called legacy tokens. People are writing manifestos about their crimes, mass shootings in particular, encouraging others to do the same, and live streaming their work. They want to be recognized for what they're doing. They want to be seen as infamous, as being man enough to stand up to these communities. That's rather problematic, I would suggest. Replacement theory. I'm going to read you a little. I know I might put you to sleep here. Something about white supremacy that you all should know about. We are befuddled by a particular irony about the shooter's indictment of Jews and Muslims as acting subversively, and at times in concert, to replace the white race. Indeed, the very accusation to overthrow is evidence of white supremacy. When you say, these people are overthrowing our society, you're suggesting to me that your society is supreme. It suggests an existing control structure which requires toppling. Could this be an admission of guilt from the shooters and their ilk? Rarely is the accusation of replacement met with a logical question. If we, Jews and Muslims, are replacing you, the white supremacist, what gives you the right to reign supreme? This is an especially interesting observation when we consider that often white supremacists, let us be generous and say those of the mainstream variety, vehemently denounce the idea that white supremacy exists. They are partially correct. White supremacy lies obscure, hidden from plain sight. In her book, White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, Robin DiAngelo tells us, Racism is a structure, not an event. While hate groups that openly proclaim white supremacy do exist, and this term refers to them also, the popular consciousness solely associates white supremacy with those radical groups. This reductive definition obscures the reality of the larger system at work and prevents us from addressing this system. The United States is a global power, and through movies and mass media, corporate culture, advertising, US-owned manufacturing, military presence, historical colonial relations, missionary work, and other means, white supremacy is circulated globally. This powerful ideology promotes the idea that whiteness as the ideal for humanity well beyond the West. Mills describes white supremacy as the unnamed political system that has made the modern world what it is today. Although white supremacy has shaped Western political thought for hundreds of years, it is never named. In this way, white supremacy is rendered invisible, while other political systems, socialism, capitalism, fascism, are identified and studied. Much of white supremacy's power is drawn from its invisibility, taken for granted aspects that underwrite all other political and social contracts. How do we deal with this? How do you deal with what's happening today? Do we continue to hide in our institutions? Or do we confront this reality through the thing that we talked about yesterday, which is contact, more engagement, more civic work outside of our institutions? And I'm actually going to finish a little earlier than I anticipated and open it up for questions, if that's okay. We'll do that. What questions, comments, or concerns? Unless you want to take a break first, like you said, or you want to wait until... Go ahead and take questions. I'm happy to take questions, sure. Sure, please. Oh, whoever was first, I don't know, sorry.
I think you caught glimpses of my personality to know what side of the spectrum I stand on when it comes to preservers, the one they want to keep the tradition as is back from home, and the other side of things. But I see wisdom in both sides, really. So my question is there a reality where there is a balance between the two? Because for people who are calling for tradition, they're looking at masajid and these establishments as sanctuaries. Like they want to come and show exemplary situations of what it means to be. That's at least one of the perspectives that they're saying. So is there a balance when we're not shunning either side of the equation?
Integration. Integration preserves some culture. The thing is, I suspect we have to figure out what cultural aspects we want to preserve. We are not unique. If you look at the Jewish communities have fractured because of the exodus, the diaspora they find themselves in. So on one end of the spectrum you have what's called Reform Jews, right? Then you have Messianic Jews, then you have Orthodox Jews, Hasidic Jews, and others, precisely because they couldn't figure it out amongst themselves. So the Reform Jews said, you know what, it's nice pageantry, it's nice to have the song and dance and so on, the theatrics of Judaism, but we are not going to be visibly identified as Jews. I mean, this is as a byproduct of the racism and exclusion they face. You know, the Ivy League universities and others never accepted Jews for a long time. Then there are those who wanted to adhere to the literal interpretation of their faith and believe that that's the way forward, but you see them in places like Williamsburg, New York, where I grew up. It's outside of Brooklyn. These are the Hasidic communities that actually have their own policing, their own ambulances. They really are self-contained and fear the outside world. If you can think of a Christian comparison, it would be not the Mormons, what are the people in the Amish, right? The question here, and this is for all of us, I don't have an answer, is what are the objectives of each? For one, it's to preserve. For the other, it's to assimilate. Is there some fine medium that we can engage in? I mean, you see some of the actors and some of the comedians that have gone on, Rami and others that have gone on to do these shows, we would agree potentially that, as Muslims who are adherent to the faith, that they've potentially gone too far for representation. But they find themselves in a quandary. They want to show the world their identity. They want to show it in the fullest possible way, while still showing people that we're just like you, we're no different. That's fundamentally what's at play here. Are we different or are we not? Are we humans? Are we Americans? Are we American Muslims? There was a long debate about should we call it American Muslims or Muslim Americans. This was in one of our old mosques. So the answer is I don't know. The answer is that's a collective responsibility for all of us to figure out. And that's why when you think about planning for these organizations, that's a good question to pose to the community. How do we want to be seen? How do we want our children to be seen? How do we want to be seen by our children internally and the stakeholders internally? And how do we want to be perceived by others outside? Are we an inviting place? Are we hosting events for the broader community? Can you come here to vote? Can you come here as a storm shelter? Are we open? What does it mean to be a masjid in a non-Muslim world? As I suggested yesterday, that the books of fiqh have largely been written where we were the majority, not the minority. So now the thinking is, and unfortunately we don't have a structure. Each of us is having to do this thinking by themselves. And I mean that quite literally, by themselves. Exactly. And so, good question to pose to the community and see where you all want to go and how you want to be perceived. I can't answer that, but I would suggest to you that integration would be an ideal. Barakallahu feek. Yes. I'm sorry, I think he had a question first.
Yeah, so I love your comments. I know it's a very controversial.
I can't, I'm sorry. What's that noise? Oh, okay. No, you're fine, I just can't hear. Go ahead.
Yeah. Cannot hear me? It's a long discussion.
Oh, this is one of those questions.
Alright, so I wrote my thoughts here throughout your speech. Jazakumullah khairan. It's really good to to think and go deep in our thoughts, and also you, mashallah, you have a very academic foundation in the way you speak. So the things that, and I know it's a very controversial things, is the rules and the regulations that we have it in our communities, and being absorbed in the external environment, assimilation in the external environment. So that's something very controversial here. What should we do? And I believe, and throughout my readings from multiple books and Islamic theologists and thinkers, so we are here need to raise our generation not just to protect their identity. We need them to be proud of their identity, not just to protect it. We need them to lead the humanity, to correct the humanity beliefs, their manners, and to mingle them with that way, to be leadership. And this is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran, لِيُظْهِرَهُ عَلَى الدِّينِ كُلِّهِ, Islam related to other beliefs. And Allah mentioned about us as an ummatan wasatan litakunu shuhada'a 'ala an-nas. So, and also we Muslim, we accept what is good, what is matching with our society, with our beliefs, and we reject what is bad. We cannot say because what you just mentioned, that because they are mixing outside and the way they eat, the way they dress, the way they speak, we have the same exact mixing. We are Muslims, and the Prophet ﷺ said, لا تكن إمعة إن أحسن الناس أحسن وإن أساءوا أسأت. And Imam al-Ghazali said about تجديد الإسلام, he said تجديد الإسلام ليس نقل الدين من مكانه حيث يهوى الناس بل نقل الناس من نطاق أهوائهم حيث يرضي الله عز وجل. So, and the Prophet ﷺ also mentioned specifically about this. So, as long as our regulation and it is basic foundation from the Quran, from the Sunnah, we adopt it. For example, about the mixing and the thing. They were mixing in the masjid of the Prophet. Women was praying, but when there are lots of them, then the Prophet said, لو أنكم جعلتم هذا الباب للنساء. Abdullah ibn Umar, he never entered through that door, and it still exists till this time. So that's definitions or subset of rules, and as the scholar said, from bab sadd al-zara'a, not mixing is haram because of itself is haram, but because of what it could happen afterwards. This is my first thought about assimilation in the outsider, bigger environment around us, and how could be our relationship with them. So because if we start to, make it easy so that we accept outside culture, dress, manners to come here, then the outside, they don't have standards. Today they have specific standards, tomorrow they have different standards. In future, you never know, you see LGBT, homosexuality becomes a norm. So what can we do to protect ourselves here? So that's my first thought, and the second thought about the victimitis or the victim mindset, probably I will discuss it later.
Jazakallah khair, barakallah feek. A lot to unpack, an entire lecture, but I noted you used the words, we Muslims. Is it better to raise your children as a good human being or a good Muslim? A good Muslim. A good Muslim. An Ahmadiyya Muslim? Hanafiya even. What about Maliki?
No, I mean Islam Hanif. الدين الحنيف ليس not a Muslim fiqhi.
I see. But, okay. A Daesh Hanafiya Muslim? Because he or she will tell you that they're Hanafiya Muslimin, they're Tabi'een, they're Salafi. Who? Exactly. A good Muslim, a good human can be a good Muslim. A good Muslim might not be a good human being. A good Muslim according to whom? According to whose standards? What are the standards that we're judging our children, ourselves by? A good Muslim that is Shi'i? A good Muslim that is Sunni? Salafi? A good Muslim that is a strong adherent to the Hanafi school, Maliki school? They will exclude others. That's not a good Muslim. Remember, just last night I told you about doing this. This used to get your finger broken in some masajid. The guy wanted to exclude me from Jannah for wearing shorts in Colorado. A good Muslim according to whose standards? So we have an internal struggle amongst ourselves to understand what a good Muslim is before we say we Muslims. Is a good Muslim a hijabi or a non-hijabi woman? Who makes that determination? So let me ask another question. Going off of that, a Jewish rabbi on TikTok he's of the Hasidic persuasion. You said the clothing and so on, you mentioned clothing. He said Jewish women are not supposed to wear pants. In the 1980s and 90s, in Muslim countries, if a woman wore pants, she was called a whore. In many Khaliji countries, a man was deemed gay if he's wearing pants, or he's trying to follow the West. So when you say our standards of attire, for example, we need to follow the prophets, then you should be wearing a skirt.
No, the fuqaha, the religions, they give a generic description.
Correct. What I'm suggesting to you is I'm trying to problematize your question. Because if we want to be historically accurate, we have to acknowledge that our scholars have competed on these issues, have fought over these issues, what to wear, what not to wear. Yet last night I mentioned to you Yasir Qadi. You weren't here, I don't think. Yasir Qadi, when he talked about coffee being prohibited in the Hijaz at one point, he also said, I have made so many enemies. If you know the story of Yasir Qadi was a classical Salafi scholar until he went to Yale. When he went to Yale, things changed. He began to contextualize the deen for the world in which we live. He said, people have called me all kinds of vile, disgusting names because I wear a suit. He said, I am following the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. I am wearing the attire of my people. So long as it meets the specifications, it's perfectly fine. But the people that are calling him vile, disgusting names believe themselves to be good Muslims. And it's okay to denigrate and disrespect other Muslims to show how good of a Muslim I am, it's okay for me to call a fellow Muslim disgusting, vile names because I disagree with the way that they're dressing. So when we say we Muslims, we haven't figured out who the we are. When I suggested to you that the mass shooters had to show that they are going to be different, they blended in, but they're going to stand up and they're going to do the right thing, that's what these Muslims on the comments are doing. It's not because they care about what he's wearing, it's because they want to show the rest of the people that are reading the comments, look at my piety. This is how a good Muslim dresses. So I'm suggesting to you that we have a lot of questions to ask internally before we make a determination about the big sort of grandiose ideas that the brother Mustafa was talking about earlier, that we don't know what we're doing. You said, do we want to protect or lead? Protect our identity or lead? I said that masjids, institutions like this, and I would not limit it to masjids. I'm thinking that we need to establish tertiary institutions, third-party institutions, hospitals, colleges, universities, like others have done here in the US. They need to be launch pads for success. I agree with you 100%. Currently, it's protecting, it's not leading. Currently, we're functioning in that mode of protecting identity. On NPR, National Public Radio, there was a book about fundamentalism and conservatism and what it does to religious groups. And it was about all religious groups, but the lady was mentioning a Muslim context. There's a book in Saudi and Hijaz, it's everywhere now, it's called Tawq al-Hamama. Are you familiar with it? Basically about sexual relations between a husband and wife. The woman mentioned another book. She said this was written in the time of the Umayyads or something. It was commissioned by one of the sultans, Muslim, for a researcher in that time to talk about the sexuality, the detailed sexual questions between husbands and wives. She said, at a time when Muslims were superior, issues of identity like how should the hijab be, how long should the beard be, how long should the pants be, etc., were null and void. They weren't having these discussions. They were interested in the arts and they were interested, look at Andalusia, right? The people that today are vehemently orthodox and militant in their orthodoxy, they keep telling us, look back to the Islamic golden age. If I took you and put you in the golden age of Islam, you'd kill those people. Because you would deem them heretics, because they're the ones that translated Plato and Aristotle and others. They're the ones that were invested in the arts and the humanities and the social sciences. They're the ones that questioned all of the assumptions so that they can get us to where we got before we decline. So this particular book, she says, was talking about, no children here, we're all adults, was talking about the intimate, she was talking about private parts and how to interact in intimate relations between one's wife, one's husband, etc., in the bedroom, as very explicit as one can get. She said Muslims went from that to looking at whose beard is longer. And that's a product of intellectual decline. When there's no more thought, but you want to simply protect identity, you prefer form over substance. In the 80s and 90s, I keep referring to this because this is when I grew up. It was literally form over substance, not wearing of the pants, not appearing in public and this and that. And it's micromanaging the Muslim in ways that are very peculiar. One of my family members is a medical student, just graduated in Hijaz, in Saudi. Her father's a medical doctor, her mother's a medical doctor. She just took off her hijab. Her parents are so strict. She loves to draw. But every time she drew a human, she would put lines through their neck. Because that way it's not challenging Allah and His creation, according to some hadiths that were attributed to Saudis, right? At the time. My sister had the same complex. But that's not the intention. Where does intentionality go? These are the people that told us pictures are haram, unless it's the king on every street. So we have to understand that Islam is a byproduct of geopolitics. It's the religion in bed with the state in ways that were detrimental to us, in ways that a medical doctor who's supposed to be the top echelon, thinking and thought are subservient and can't even reason when you tell them, why are you doing this? This doesn't make, well, you put a line through the neck, khalas, you're done. But it's so deeply ingrained, they're scared to question, they're scared to ask basic assumptions and so forth. What kind of control does that have we succumbed to? That's happened to us. We can't have a conversation without getting mad at each other because we have a difference of opinion. So my argument is, yes, we need to lead, but we're currently in the protecting phase. And we need to talk about why that is and how to overcome it. And I know that doesn't answer the girthy kind of question that you asked, but I hope it addresses something. I think this brother, and then we'll go, now, this, was it you or him? Both, okay, so you pick between you two. Who goes first? Take it easy, Amin, until you ask too many questions.
I think you've already answered the premise of my questions.
Khalas, then sit down.
There is no you're a
No.
hard audience for questions.
Go ahead.
Jazakallah khair.
Barakallah feek.
Actually,
Barakallah.
thank you very much. Very thoughtful lecture.
Thank you.
Gave me a lot to think about. I'm trying to tie it into practice. So a quick comment about what you said earlier. I think you and us should dissociate the different threads of issues. When you said, who defines a good Muslim? How do you define identity? The internal discussions and the issues of culture should be separated from the need to define an identity. That's a different question. It should not preclude, it should not prevent us from actually attempting to do that, because other than that, there is no definition. Not everybody who says, I'm a sheikh, becomes an authority. The problem with the net now, we have access to a lot of information. Just because they're a sheikh and they have a name and they profess to speak for Islam doesn't give them the authority, and that's part of the problem.
Correct.
There are some people who are liable, who have the precedence and have ijma', whatever is the criteria for that. That needs to be factored in.
Can I stop you?
Yes.
Barakallah feek. Just hold on to your thought for just a second. There was a TikTok sheikh who was showing us his outfit for Eid on TikTok, and then what he does for Eid day. So he goes and he bicycles and etc. This is giving credence to your comment. I just want to do that before you move on. And in his bio it says, Sheikh, Imam, scholar, etc., right? / Yours truly couldn't help myself. So I said, since you're a scholar, can you tell me some of your publications? Make dua for me, brother. I'm working on that. I said, but, okay, so when you do work on that, what do you intend to publish? Inshallah, just make dua for us and it will, but you call yourself a scholar, and that's intentional. When you call yourself a scholar, it's to appease the people to come to you and think that you're more than just a conduit between Google and the question. Among many scholars and imams in the Muslim community, and certainly in the Muslim Western community. And so that's just to confirm what you're saying. Indeed, a lot of people are purporting to be something that they're not. And that gives them legitimacy and credibility within their group, and that's problematic. Fadl, sorry.
And while that question is pending, we still have to answer our everyday challenges of our lives. So it's a bigger discussion, we don't have an easy answer.
Correct.
So what you've done this morning is you've given us a field, you've defined the issues of the community, the problems, and you tried to assign statistics through your research and your readings. So I appreciate that. Now the next step that I think Brother Haytham and myself and maybe some of the audience, they want to know how we're going to act. And you've mentioned that we have to come to a consensus. So that's really where all my questions are coming in. I'll just mention one question because the rest of them spill into the same nafs al-majra, the same path.
No.
And I think the first one or two will probably clarify this.
Who's Brother Haytham, so I can get mad at
Who's
someone? Oh,
He's the one who asked the question for me.
the two troublemakers.
So
Barakallah feek.
the main crux of what you're advising is to be non-judgmental, right? So
In
the way I
certain cases.
So what I wrote down is, how do you distinguish being non-judgmental from an endorsement of an action, right? We frequently take non-judgment as either an endorsement, and I know that's not the intention, but that's really the fine line we're walking, either in public life or in Islamic life. because you know what's right or wrong. The distinguish between these two distinction has to be clear. At the same time, how do you keep the door open for people to improve and be able to come with their problems so they can seek solutions? So I know that's your intention, but that is the crux of the difficulty of addressing this and where the lines are drawn within a community. So an ambiguous presentation of good or bad, or right or wrong for one's personal choices, family or community, those have to be made clear. Otherwise, there is no guidance for it.
Can I answer that?
Sure, everything else spills into the same river
Okay.
of that thought. Basically.
Non-judgmental is a position of neutrality, right?
Supposedly,
Supposedly.
yeah.
I don't advocate for that. I do advocate for giving advice.
Okay.
A is the advice solicited. So in a circumstance where your child comes to you and says, well, look, this is what I'm facing, etc. I'm not suggesting I can't help you. That's not what I mean. I'm not suggesting neutrality. I'm suggesting advice. Judgment is a negative discourse. All right? It's a pejorative use of the word. So when you say judgmental, you're shame on you. This is that. That's what I mean. That's what I mean by non-judgmental. It does not imply neutrality. It doesn't imply, as I understand it, that you do nothing. Obviously you advise, that's your role as an institution, as a parent, etc. But the way in which that's done, I think that when youth come and say, yes, Muslims are judgmental, that's what they're referring to, is the pejorative sense of judgment. Right? There is obviously a right and a wrong, and I'm not suggesting that neutrality is the way to go.
Yes.
That answers it.
Because my next comment is, isn't judgment an essential component of self-protection, of meritocracy? Whether it's for marriage, for job, for entrusting someone with your children's care, you make a judgment in that case on someone's credential. Are they a drug addict? Are they trustworthy? Can you invest and give them money to invest your money? Those are all judgments which you render sort of an assessment of someone's characters, behavior, and whatnot. They may feel belittled, but that's, to be honest, their problem. And my next point on that one is a lot of perception of people's comments, judgments, quote unquote, has to do with our perception of the world. And it's not about extremism. You talked about people in your surveys that are not so much to the left, not so much to the right, but it's my personal opinion that the issues is not so much in extremism, but we are bombarded and populated by concepts that permeate our life, permeates the media, our social aspects, whether it's in schools, and those fills our mind with expectations. And on that basis, we judge whether our religious institutions are welcoming or not, judgmental or not, and basically whether you're in the right or wrong or not. And everything else is along the
Yeah,
line.
no, Jazakallah khair. Was that it?
No, so the answers to all of these guides, how we're going to build, whether our schools are quote-unquote bubble insulated, or they are a safe environment for you to grow and nourish, because the next point about the schools, I don't think the intention was ever to be a bubble, but to create a nurturing enough environment at certain age groups where it's critical. When you're old enough to have a critical thinking, then you can be a little more open perhaps. This is all subject of debates and thoughts, and you see variations of implementation. So I never subscribe to the point, maybe if you're trying to draw a clear picture, I understand where you're coming from, but I think those are consideration, but not clear answers for them.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. Karl Marx said, social scientists always point the finger at society, but our job is to change it. Not just to point the finger at it, but to change it. So there is a sense of agency that you do have to take action. Again, neutrality is not what I meant here. And I appreciate you sort of addressing this in a very broad, conceptual way. I would suggest that maybe what you're doing is reading too much into the terminology. So the lexicon, the use of the word judgment here, you're involved in the etymological sort of understanding. You want to go back to the roots of the word. I wouldn't go so far back, but I would suggest to you that there are clear signs of negative judgment, neutrality, and sort of positive judgment, if we can frame it that way. There are observable ways in which an institution has failed and has deemed itself to judge people in negative ways. The exodus of people is one piece of evidence that they have judged them in a way that if it's just her, Well, maybe it's a deficiency in her, sorry. But if it's a group of people, just like I said with the homeless issue, then we have to hold something is going on here. They can't all be perceiving subjectively that this is a negative judgment and in fact it could be positive. No, something is going on here, that there's a mass exodus from the institution. So we need to be truthful with ourselves and investigate. Investigate with good assumptions. That's husn al-dhann, as they say. So I guess, so that answers that, I hope, or at least where I'm coming from. And I also understand, look, as I tell my students, when you look at any theorist, any academic in our discipline, you have to understand that they come from a time and a place. I am colored by my view of the world is colored by my experiences. And I'm happy to delve into my experiences, but I adhere to something called critical theory. Critical theory is not very popular because it looks at the negative. And it sees the world in a sort of a negative perspective. That is to say that it looks at the underlying assumptions. So when you say to me, well, marijuana is illegal, these are, therefore these people are criminals for consuming marijuana, I say to you, well, who created the label of marijuana being illegal? To whose benefit does that serve? And if that were the case, why is it legal here and illegal in the next state over? Are there some nefarious intentions here behind this criminal label? Right? So that's critical theory, and that's how I approach the Muslim community. It doesn't make me very popular, but that said, with respect to the schools, I do not deny positive intentions. I do not deny good intentions in any of these institutions that open up these schools, but when you see it sort of objectively, stepping away from it, just like the killer who killed, stepping away from it and our feelings and emotions, and we look back at this experiment called Muslims in America since 1965, really since before, but the latest wave, since 1965 until now. What have we accomplished? When a new community comes in, they say, I want to open a masjid. Oh, did you hear they're going to open another masjid? Well, we have 20 others. What have they achieved collectively? Well, guess what that masjid's going to have? Guess. An Islamic school and a Quran memorization school. And we're repeating the same thing and expecting a different result. The outcome has not proven itself yet to be sufficient. Maybe sometime down the road if we continue this game long enough. For me, I think from 1965 until now, it's a bit of a long time, and we've done this for quite a while. We're seeing kids leave the masajid. There's a Pew Research study that looked at millennials in general and faith, and they're seeing that millennials are leaving faith, whether you're Jewish or Muslim or whatever, they're leaving. That could be a byproduct of the openness of social media and so on and so forth. The futility of borders and trying to close in and so on, it's becoming very futile. You all have phones, the three of you gentlemen? It's a futile effort to work on concealing, and again, that's my assumption, that's where I'm going from. I know that it was intended to be good, but that's really, if you look at it objectively, what are we trying to do? What is the role here? And in our programming, in the school programming, are we focusing on rote memorization? Or are we looking at, Maslow's hierarchy? Do I have any teachers here? Anybody here teacher? No, Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy. What's the highest level? What's the lowest level of Bloom's taxonomy? Yeah, the bottom is rote memorization. The lowest form of education is rote memorization. And as you go up and as you ascend, then it's sort of this idea of synthesis. You take different ideas, you mix them together, you come up with something new. Where are our Islamic schools? We're at the lowest tier since 1965. Objectively, we're not doing what we say we want to do. We need to have measurements. Dalia Mugahed. Anybody here heard of Dalia Mugahed? Yaqeen Institute and others? They published a paper on programming for Sunday schools because they realized it's outdated programming, it's not measurable, there's nothing going on. We're not doing anything. We're just babysitting children on Sundays among their peers. What's our objective? What's our end goal? So I would suggest to you that on an objective level, aside from what I say, because I am subjective, I acknowledge that, let's step back and see what these institutions are doing. And if the answer is we're not accomplishing any goals that we intend to meet, then maybe we need to think about diversifying types of institutions. Not everything has to be run by a masjid. There needs to be hospitals and colleges, and so when I go back to North Carolina, how many masajid do you have in the Denver area? We have 20. MashaAllah, MashaAllah. What I don't say is one imam stole $1 million. 20 masajid for me is not a MashaAllah moment. It's a'udhu billah. Because 20 masajid suggests to me that, and none of them are communicating. None of them are working together to some common goal. Okay, 20 masajid, then what? Brothers and sisters, join us for a fundraising, we're going to open another masjid. But how does that take you out of your shell? How does that, Duke University is a Methodist university. My university is a Jesuit university. Caesar Beccaria, Bentham, that I mentioned to you, Bentham was educated at a Jesuit university, 17 something. And look what he gave to the world. What are we doing? When do we begin to establish institutions that actually promote the common good, the social good, beyond just the masajid to become insular? And again, that's my sort of 2 cents on that. I apologize. Yes, sister. Barakallah. Be quiet, I don't like your comment. Stigma, social stigma. I don't know if you expect me to say something very wise. I'm going to say something very controversial. The way in which we structure our programming, always a schism. Some of you might not like to hear this, but I'm of the opinion that that needs to stop. As long as modesty is enforced, as long as we're a collective body, I think that needs to stop. Because working together on projects as the youth, helping for a camp, doing something for the homeless, etc., together, I see no problem whatsoever, as opposed to a girls' event and a boys' event. I don't see a religious problem with that. I don't see a social problem with that they're working together collectively under the supervision of adults, and they're working for the same aims. They're interacting with one another. One of the biggest criticisms that we would hear from the so-called self-professed shuyukh among the youth, the kids that live in the masjid all the time. By the way, that's a measure that I really despise, this idea that this kid, mashallah, is always at the masjid. I said, well, he doesn't have a life? That's a problem for me, right? To be that child always at the masjid, that's a problem for me, especially in your high school age and so on and so forth. The self-professed youth in the university where I come from would say, man, you should see these Muslims, they use it for dating, MSA. And I'm not suggesting that they're dating in the traditional sense, that they're somehow getting together, working on projects at the university together. So to them, to their holiness, that's deemed somewhat problematic. There needs to be a structure, and that's up to you all, how to develop that structure. I suspect if I open the door of conversation now about this topic, you're all going to fight. I really do, and that's something that's beyond the scope of what I'm doing here. I'm happy to leave this place and let you all fight, but at the same time, let me give you an example of a community where I was kicked out of. Not kicked out of, but certainly not welcomed back. The Imam brought me in to give a talk, and there were youth there, much like you all, there were men and women. And we talked about dating in the Muslim context. And when they heard the word dating, some people lost their mind. Some of the old-timers lost their mind because they said, to them dating is the sort of Jennifer, Samantha, Robert kind of situation, right? That's not the dating that we're talking about. I'm talking about, look, you have a situation in which economically it's no longer feasible for guys to continue to marry non-Muslims, while Muslim women, as they say in Arabic, يُعَنِّسُ, يعني they're no longer of marriage age, they get old and they're not going to. So what's the solution in the context of where we live? Speed dating, I suggested. This was actually suggested by another brother elsewhere. Speed dating is where you sit at a table with someone for 5 minutes, typically under the supervision of others. I suggested using the multi-purpose hall. The Imam is there, others there from the congregation, married couples are there. They're helping to set up the discussion. You sit and you're talking to Ahmed or Subhiya or whoever, and you both, 5 minutes, you switch tables, 5 minutes, you're getting to know each other. You're of marriage age, you came there to get married, under this structure. The brothers were vehemently protesting. The women, like yourselves, were silent. The brothers were, you're asking for the haram. I'm asking for the haram? I said, yeah, dating is haram. I said, let me ask you something. You live in a non-Muslim country where you have reverts. When you want waliyul amr, that you want, in your mind, marriage is back home, where your mom found you someone. What do you think of this girl? What do you think of this girl? That's not going to work here. Are you going to provide me a solution? And until you do provide the solution for an alternative that considers the Muslim converts, which are always never considered. They're never considered, and that's not an eye to ourselves. They're never considered in holidays, they're never considered in marriage occasions. When we speak of Muslims, we're talking about our ethnic background. And we're talking about our own experiences or the experiences of our siblings or others. We're not considering the people that are converting to Islam in large numbers. And we're not providing solutions to the actual social problem of a lack of marriage or interaction because of the schism between genders that exists. So they went on, the brothers, and I said, brother, let me ask you something. And he was showing us his piety. He kept, really upset with the Q&A. It didn't turn into a Q&A. I said, do you have a phone? He said, yes. I said, can I go through your history? Not so much. So he's pious. But he's dating and he's doing whatever he needs to do, or he's looking online at stuff that he shouldn't look at, while this girl ages and ages and ages and waits for him. And then when he decides he wants to settle down, then he wants to say what? Now it's time for you, I'm ready for you now. I'm looking for a pious wife. It's not fair to women. So unless you all, we collectively, Muslims, develop a way in which we begin to mingle in meaningful and protected ways like the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the schism is not working. The continued segregation is not working. It didn't work for blacks and whites. It's not going to work for men and women. Again, please don't misinterpret this as I'm calling for, strip clubs. That's not what I'm calling for, because that's always the refrain from the Muslim brothers. Look at what this guy's calling for. I'm calling for a rational solution to a problem, a practical solution to a practical problem that our communities are facing. And if you don't think so, wait until your children are older. My friend, he is retired, 67 years old. He has two daughters. One graduated from Duke University with a master's, the other one an undergraduate from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Neither of them are married, not even proposals. They're Indian, not even proposals. He said, I don't know what to do with them. We are looking for someone, just please come take. Imagine, that's the situation that we find ourselves in. Well, why would they? Why would guys do that in a context, in this climate, when everything is free? So I answer your question with a question. What are you all proposing to do to solve this problem? Do you even recognize that a problem exists among you that you're going to contend with for years? Now, I sat in for a very limited time, so I don't know that how much I can provide. Brother Noor, I think she was calling you, Sister Noor was. That's part of the problem. You're not doing anything. I didn't sit in there long enough to make that judgment call. But it seemed to me, as an outsider, that initially in the initial discourse there was almost a schism. They weren't talking to each other. They were there in the presence of one another. I don't find that to be problematic. But again, I refuse to sort of offer insights when I only sat there for 5 or 6 minutes. So I can't really answer that, but we can certainly take that offline, the conversation. Happy to do it. Remember I said whenever you have, I like people when I'm talking to them individually, when they start multiplying, there's more people, then it becomes a clan. In criminology, I always tell my students, how many of you are law-abiding citizens? Some of them foolishly raise their hands. And I say to them, no, none of you are. You've all violated some law. But the label of law-abiding citizen cannot exist absent the criminal. So the label of the criminal is beneficial for me to feel better than that person. Meanwhile, I've violated all kinds of laws. In the Islamic perspective, it's the heathen and the mashallah, the righteous. I have to, in order for me to feel good about myself, I have to denigrate you. I have to have the sinner in order for me to feel like I am religious or pious. That's amplified in Muslim communities. We feel so bad about ourselves, like we have a psychosis. When, you ever seen the WhatsApp thing when a Muslim wrote this, or a Muslim rode a bicycle today? Wow, look, the Muslims wrote, because we have a sense of deficiency. So any success is amplified. And so when you have a collective group that has PTSD, that has all kinds of psychological issues from war-torn countries, you think the 20, 30, 40, 50 years, 100 years of war has not affected each of us? And we do it vicariously. We tell our children the stories, which has significant implications, positive implications, advocacy and so forth, but we're also traumatizing. Generational trauma is passed on. So we take that out on one another. You're the this, you're the that, look at her hijab, look at this guy's pants, look at this, etc. Going back to answer your question, I was at a conference in the South, and an Irani woman, a scholar, was presenting as a Middle East conference, Middle East studies, and she's a hijabi. So we sat at the fireplace in the evening, we're talking, and I said, sister such and such. She said, Amin, if we say what we're saying here, in those spaces, the masajid, we would be deemed heretics. And we weren't saying anything controversial, we were just questioning. Going back to the Jum'ah, when the brother said, when I go to Jum'ah, I turn on a TED Talk. I have my earbuds, I turn on a TED Talk. This is a young brother. Because he said, if I want intellectual stimulation, I get it from TED Talks, not from the Jum'ah. Muslim spaces have unfortunately, this is why I am vehemently opposed to continued building of Muslim spaces as they have been constructed or envisioned, because they're not living up to the expectations. Muslim spaces need to be places of critical thought and analysis. When do we stop to say, if we keep talking about Andalusia, Al-Andalus, and we keep hearkening back to the golden age of Islam, at what point do we say we're going to start to work towards that? You know what that means, to work towards that? The kind of intermingling, the kind of thought, and the kind of criticism that transpired in those spaces? It's almost illegal in our Muslim spaces and centers to think at that level and to question at that level, because you'll be deemed a heretic. I would suspect that even in second generation Muslim spaces, if there are any, entirely second generation, that's been absorbed by second generation people too. They will do the same thing. I'm not silly and stupid to suggest to you that there's this utopian center where there's none of that that's going to happen. That's human inclination, human tendency to outcast and to ostracize and so on. I'm saying, how can you mitigate it? So I told you day one, I do not comfort the afflicted, I afflict the comfortable. And I also told you that I may raise more questions than answers. And this is one in which I also do the same. That's up to us collectively to make that determination. Is it going to take for an entire generation to leave the masjid? For another generation to stand alone and say, what did we just do? Are we going to open up tertiary institutions where that happens? Youth institutions, the one I spoke to in Utah, I told him, respectfully, while I appreciate you bringing me here and doing this, I said, you're doing nothing more than, I got you, Jazakallah khair. You're doing nothing more than the masjid. You are replicating masajid. So what do? They hate the masjid, so they go outside, they open a tertiary youth center, which does what? We're going to have a voting drive, we're going to collect meals for the homeless, we're going to have a blood drive. What's different between that and the masjid? The prayer, the collective, even there they pray. Moreover, let me ask you something else. Finally, the masajid are doing that. The masajid took for a long time. Voting is haram. Blood drives and all that happens elsewhere. Finally, they're doing that. But guess what? Too little, too late. Because every organization in my life does the same thing. How are you unique? Oh, you're feeding the homeless? Great. How are you talking about systemic issues that lead to homelessness? Where's the imam? The imam can very easily tell you, you have to open up the doors for charity, etc., etc. Ask the imam how many homeless people slept at his house. It's easy to say that because you're playing a character in a movie. But let me see how it reflects in your life. Moreover, these organizations are all replicating one another. What's the difference? My school, my church, the synagogue, they're all doing the same thing. What distinguishes between you as a Muslim group and the Jews or the Christians? Theology? Well, we're not really learning theology. We're doing rote memorization in schools. We're maintaining identity. Where's the theology? I suspect if I asked you heavy theological questions, which I probably wouldn't know, you wouldn't know either. Which suggests to me, what are we standing on? What's the bedrock, what's the foundation here that we're doing? I mean, that's uncomfortable, I hope. But that does not answer your question, but I hope it does. It gives you comfort that others are thinking in the same way. And I think collectively we have to come up with a solution, and it's going to be a hard fight. You're going to be resisted, you're going to be ridiculed, you're going to be exiled from your community for asking the tough questions, but that's what we need to do. As I've said to the people in Utah, when they said, what's the solution? I said the solution is a sense of protest among Muslim youth. Muslim youth can't be silent. You can't protest about plastic straws and come into a center that you're going to sleep in because there's nothing that's relevant to your life and not stand up and say, I'm holding you to account. It's not just the board, I'm holding you to account. What are you doing? What is this nonsense you're talking about in the context of what's happening outside? But that's a discussion for another time, inshallah. I'm sorry, please, yes. That's okay, we have, I think he said 10 minutes, so 7 minutes. I apologize for taking so long.
Had to do with, you mentioned assimilation yesterday.
Correct.
And you said Muslims tend to assimilate down. So I was thinking about other examples.
In our study, they assimilated down.
I see. So in the US, would you say Hindus from India and Jews, they assimilate out?
Hindus from India, I don't know. I mean, I haven't done a study, but it seems to me that there are many of them that are in positions of power. I don't know. Some of them are assimilating downward, no doubt.
I see. So the overall trend for us is downwards as for Muslims, but there are some that might be also assimilating out.
I didn't say the overall trend. I said based on our findings in the study, they were certainly assimilating downward, yes.
But is there an exception?
Oh, of course there's exceptions. You're dealing with a large social group. There's exceptions for all social groups. What's the question?
So the question is, don't you think that also has something to do with the larger political dynamics that's going on? You know, you kind of indicated this. There was a talk of clash of civilizations, last couple of decades, right? So in that case, isn't it very hard for Muslims to assimilate up, whereas it's much easier, or almost like necessitates you to find common causes to assimilate down?
It's not so much common. Thank you for the question. You're talking about Clash of Civilizations, Huntington's discussion, his book, Clash of Civilizations. I don't. I think, I don't know where the question lies, but it's obvious that, of course, it's geopolitics and social issues that influence assimilation practices. You know, I said as much yesterday with respect to public policy, how you're viewed by policy, how policy frames the discussion of this group, and thus how it creates ideas about this group from the dominant group, and the lack of co-ethnic communities that help them to assimilate in a particular fashion. Sure, if you're seen as, if you're told that you're nothing, you're outside, and then that's repeated in your own institutions when they say, the Americans and us, you are highlighting that there's a distinction between us and them. That's not a healthy discussion to have. Sure, you're going to assimilate downward. So I don't know what's the surprising answer maybe. What were you hoping for?
Well, I guess the follow-up question would be, is there a way to counter this?
That's the question I think we've been contending with for 2 days, and that's where institutions come in. That's where a collective body, and that's where the sister, I'm sorry, Faiza. Sister Faiza was alluding to this. We can't even have discussions about gender norms and issues that are very simple to address. Thinking about how we run just this one building, let alone to address the challenges that we as a collective 3.5 million in the US face. So I think it starts, the impetus for this discussion is how do we overcome challenges? Well, I told you, part of that is contact. And if we can't make direct contact, then it's vicarious contact. Positive, prolonged, meaningful contact. The problem with that is it requires a different kind of discussion. You know, if we go from it's haram to draw without drawing a line on the neck, to we now need to have actors in Hollywood, when we have people in Hollywood, what's the limitation? Are we going to have sex scenes in the movies? Are we going to, just to integrate, just to assimilate? So again, you come across two people speaking. The theologian, who is disconnected from the rest of the world because there's a schism between theology and the natural sciences and social sciences, and the people that are saying, the social scientists that say, this is how you overcome prejudice. Where are we talking to each other? No, because we created an artificial schism between the Islamic sciences, hadith and so on and so forth, language and whatnot, and the other sciences. And they're not talking to each other. These people are telling you this is the solution, but these people don't live in that space. And they can't, because any talk to one another, like Sister Faiza said, results in fights and arguments. So, yes. Correct. I mentioned this, yes. Correct. Correct.
how the achievement founded their project, and based on that we start. Instead of like, okay, let's just.
Well, let me, for the sake of time, let me answer your question. I think I know where you're going with this. Those Muslims that were going and doing all of these things, they weren't using a particular guideline. For the most part, there's Islam, as we know it, the Quran, Hadith, and so on. But they were also open to exploring, and when you mentioned India and others, some of the most brilliant minds of the Muslim world came from India and other cultures, and they brought with them some of the cultural nuance into the religion. And that's the beauty of Islam, is its malleability. Let me read you a quote, if I may, and you tell me who this is from. This is you talked about prejudice and reducing prejudice and so on, right? Being accepted in assimilation. Quote, if a Muslim lives in a non-Muslim country, regardless of whether or not that country is hostile with the Muslim countries, he will not be obligated to make himself appear different than them. This is on account of the difficulties that doing so can pose. Indeed, it might become preferable or even obligatory for him to conform to their outward practices if there is a benefit for the faith in doing so, like inviting them to Islam, or preventing hardship for the Muslims, or for realizing any other wholesome intention. Who said that? Who? Ibn Taymiyyah. Used by the most fundamental among Muslims. He's saying part of assimilation. So yes, we're not reinventing the wheel. This exists. He understood basic human psychology. But if you look at the followers of Ibn Taymiyyah, the people that called women who wore pants such and such, and the people that made derogatory statements of women or of men who wore Western clothing, because those people were co-opted by governments. What I'm suggesting to you, and 30 seconds, what I'm suggesting to you is, I don't have an answer. I can't provide you with this. This is a collective decision that we have to make amongst ourselves. In Portland, there are a few masajid. What would it take for you all to have a conference to decide, these are the rules of the game moving forward. We will be tolerant of different opinions. We're going to have annual conferences with one another. We're going to have objectives, etc. And the same thing in North Carolina and in Colorado, etc. We will agree to disagree. We will do so civilly. We need bigger objectives than ourselves. These are the games of the rule today. We can't keep hearkening backward because we don't have the time to do that. We need to come up with our own game plan and move forward accordingly. And it's very doable because every state has just a few masajid. Get together, the leadership. Think about conferences that are actually meaningful, not when is the Eid this year, is the sun coming up, is the moon sighting. It was such a big controversy in North Carolina when the masajid decided to do this. People, you remember, people called the imams kuffar because they're using science. سبحانك اللهم بحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.
Assalamualaikum. Just a quick reminder, 5 p.m. will be the women's session in here, and then at 6:30 there's dinner for the women and the young adults, and the young adults will be at 7:30 inshallah after dinner.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله